Hello everybody, my name is Mariusz Skrobala. I'm a publicist and political activist from Poland. And today with me, joining me once more, Luca Siniscalco. Hello, Luca.
Hello, Marius. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a great pleasure to have you here once more because a few months ago we did a video about Julius Evola in general and the history of Julius Evola Foundation. And today we are going to talk about one of his books, and the title is in English Metaphysics of Sex. It was published in 1958 in Rome, and some people could be a little bit surprised that a radical traditionalist chooses a subject like this. Although Evola wrote few books, not entirely about the subject of tradition. I'm talking about, for example, the doctrine of awakening, about Buddhism. So here we have another title. Luca, from what I know, Evola translated the famous book of Otto Weininger, Sex and Character, and then he made a decision to write his own book on this subject, yes?
Yes, it's right. The book you have mentioned is called in German Geschlecht und Charakter, Sex and Character. It's a book published in 1903, and it was part of the research interest of Evola. Weininger is a very controversial author. He suicided himself, but he developed these very interesting reflections about a sort of philosophy of sex, theorizing the existence of two archetypes, the man, the absolute man and the absolute woman, who are somehow metaphysical character issues, which then realize themselves in the real man and woman. And the idea of Weininger was that man and woman should reach their inner realization by following their archetypes, and so realizing in the concrete living world their essence. And Evola was deeply influenced by this reflection. And as you have correctly mentioned, he published the Italian translation of this book for the publishing house Bocca in the year 1956. And then 2 years later, he published Metafisica del Sesso, Metaphysics of Sex, for the publishing house Athanor, which subsequently was re-edited in various editions by Edizioni Mediterranee from the 1969. And we could that consider Metaphysics of Sex a sort of theoretical and historical religious deepening of Weininger's thesis, however read in the specific traditionalist perspective of Evola, the one that, as we all know, he developed after the encounter with firstly Regini and then René Guénon. And this is also somehow introductory attempt to answer to your question, why a traditionalist should write a text like this. Because Evola wanted to somehow to prove, to adopt the traditional lens to show that this metaphysical structure is not only fundamental in order to achieve a Weltanschauung worldview on religious, political, historical grounds, but also to interpret the full aspects of life. And sex and love, of course, are fundamental aspects of the life of the concrete man in all the historical times. So Evola was somehow interested to also methodologically to try to adopt a traditionalist lens to a topic which in our society is mainly considered just on a profane level, but which in archaic societies, in pre-modern societies and cultures was indeed a very symbolical, metaphysical, even religious and esoteric issue.
Yes, and Otto Weininger was a very, as you said, controversial character. He committed suicide and he was accused of misogyny because of some opinions about women that he implemented in his work. But Luca, I have one question that is very interesting for people who speak English, because we don't have almost any biographical information about Evola in English, maybe only Gianfranco de Turi's book about the period of Evola during the Second World War, and some quite big introduction to Men Among the Ruins by Henkel, I think, yes, the name is.
Okay.
So yeah, T.H. Hansen, excuse me. Yeah, that's the right one. And my question is about the private life of Evola. Did he have any relationship with women? Because we know that he devoted his life entirely to philosophy, and later, after Second World War, when he was crippled and on a wheelchair, he spent the entire rest of his life in his apartment in Rome. What did it look like before?
Yeah, that's a very fascinating and mysterious topic somehow, because Evola, in his books and articles, always tried to adopt the principle, the traditional principle of the active impersonality, which concretely means not to speak too much about himself, or to speak about his biography only when it was considered relevant or useful from a theoretical or political point of view. Therefore, we didn't have any direct narration or perspective by Evola himself on this topic. However, there are some researchers who have tried to analyze also this private life of Evola, which is, however, interesting, not to make gossip, but to better understand his character and the relation between his concrete life, which was a very intense life spent among politics, travels, alpinism, and many activities, which also involved the feminine world. We know that Evola was not married and he didn't have sons, but we also know from several sources that he was quite interested, so to speak, in the world of women, and he had various relationships until the Second World War. The most famous one, which has also somehow a literary and cultural relevance, is the one with the Italian writer Sibilla Aleramo, who is particularly known in Italy for the fiction book Amo Dunque Sono, which I could roughly translate I love, so I am, where Evola appears in some pages of the book as a character with the pseudonymous of Bruno Tellegra, who is described as a gelid glacial architect, because we know that Evola had academic education in this specific field. And he's also described with several negative nuances, which were caused by the radical rupture of their relation, which was we know, a quite complicated relation, because she was quite older than Evola, who was still quite young. We are in the 20s. And she then also had a relation with Giulio Parise, who was an esotericist, a member of the group of Ur, who was in touch with Evola for magic and occult reason. So all these complicated relation testify a quite passionate relation with many internal conflicts, and will influence somehow also the future of the group of Ur and the interruption of the activity of the group. On this story, the most information have been collected in Italy by my friend Andrea Scarabelli, who has written this very huge and rich biography on Evola, which is called Adventurous Life of Julius Evola, and which will be in the future translated also in other European languages, such as French and English. So I hope that also more readers from other countries would have the opportunity to read this book, and also to discover more information about these aspects of Evola's private life. Another name which I would like then to mention, although we don't have specific and objective witnesses about a love affair with Evola, but we are sure that this fascinating woman was in touch with him for esoteric reason, is the name of Maria Denaglowska, who was a Russian woman, but with a very cosmopolitical attitude. She traveled a lot in Europe, and she was then established in French. And she developed very interesting reflections about occultism and the magic role of sex within occult practices. And I'm also mentioning her because she's quoted by Evola in the book we are analyzing, Metaphysics of Sex, in the last chapter, the 6th one. Among the contemporary trends in esotericism in relation to sex magic, there is a section devoted to Maria Denaglowska, where Evola affirms that from a traditional point of view, the theories proposed by these occultists are not completely orthodox and coherent, but he also adds that there are some somehow archaic reminiscent theories that somehow are incorporated in this position, which so he thinks result, however, interesting for contemporary man and reader. In this case, this fascinating woman was somehow, apart from the specific love aspect, but was for sure relevant for the life and also the intellectual development of Evola. So we can somehow conclude, just as introductory note, that the image of machist and anti-feminist author, which sometimes is attributed to Evola, is far from being true, and all the information we have about this topic in his life shows respect or fascination towards the feminine world. I also received, this is the last thing I want to say about this topic, a very interesting personal memory by the owner and the director of Edizioni Mediterranee, who was a friend of Evola and who was in touch with him, Giovanni Canonico, who told us that he remembered that Evola once went in touch with a young girl, probably from Rome, who had a very bad accident, who ruined somehow her face, her body. And Evola was very disappointed because his physical aspect could ruin the life of a person, and helped this girl to have medical surgery helped from an economic point of view, I mean, to have medical surgery to somehow restore or try to restore her previous condition. And this oral narration, which was offered to me by this very cultivated man and friend of Evola, is another sign of this, I will say, generous and positive attitude of him towards the feminine world. Although it's true that the anti-feminist topics which are present in Weininger somehow also affected some reflections in Metaphysics of Sex, which, however, in my opinion, have been differently from Weininger, reread through the very productive and fertile lens of tradition, so in a dualistic and respectful manner also for the feminine part of reality.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to Evola and the role of women, and it's a little bit used by the far left, who tries to criticize him or paint him in some bad shadows. The thing is that modernity was built around the notion of equality. It's a political notion coming from the French Revolution, and it's a complete abstract that doesn't exist anywhere in the real world. And I think the basis of all traditionalism, including Evola, is that there are two natures. One is the nature of men, the other one is the nature of women, and those natures are different, and they cannot be the same. That's what creates the polarity between the man and the woman, yeah. And most of people don't understand that a man and a woman can have a completely different role in reality, yeah, because they think with this modern notion of equality.
Yeah, that's completely right and express perfectly the viewpoint of Evola. This idea comes from this ideal topic of the duality or the polarity between the absolute man and the absolute woman, who then, according to Evola's perspective, somehow are embodied by the real, the concrete, the historical man and woman in different grades, because concrete men and women, according to Evola, that's also interesting, are not absolute men and women, because each of us has in itself a percentage of attitude, of spiritual polarity, which is of the other sex. But the point is that for Evola, a spiritual path should lead men to try to be to move towards this ideal of absolute man and woman to the absolute woman, because then in the relation between them, the more men are men and women are women, the more their relation has a good, productive result, both in the historical political context and in the spiritual world. Because when Evola speaks in Metaphysics of Sex, referring to several traditions on the possibility to realize a unity of sex, so a unity of men and women through the sexuality, he refers also about the myth of the androgyne. The idea is not to refuse, of course, the natural sex, instead to sublime them on a spiritual level. And in order to do that, man needs to be aware of his spiritual role, as likewise women need to do the same. So it's not a abandon of the dualism, but somehow an enrichment of them, sublimation of them in this spiritual unity, which is a unity on a spiritual level, not on a body level.
This notion of equality shows you how absurd it is, because if men and women are equal, they are all the same. There is no difference between them. What makes them men and women is the difference between them. They're different natures, yeah. And this shows not only the absurdity of it, but also some kind of craziness of the modern world, which tries to erase those differences. And when those differences are erased, there's nothing left. There is no identity, because the difference is the identity of men and women. Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. That's the we'll say, yeah, the socio-political effect of this misunderstanding, which in this book Evola try to show has not only a political origin, which is of course relevant, but it's more treated in other books, but also is the product of a spiritual confusion, of a spiritual misunderstanding. And this is interesting because underlines another methodological aspect which we can find in all Evola texts, books, articles, which is typical of traditionalist thought, and which is the attempt to find a hermeneutical structure which, starting from metaphysical principles, is then able to explain the full reality. So again, some daily human activities which in contemporary culture are often reduced to their mere appearance, to their material and biological dimension, are explained in Evola, by Evola, has the material historical effects of a spiritual and metaphysical fight. And this is really interesting, I think.
You use the term spiritual confusion, and on the level of the society, now we see how tragic it is when it comes to, for example, this notion of transgender surgery, when young children don't know which sex they are, and they are trying to change it, although it's completely impossible because modern medicine doesn't have the means to change it. They can only mutilate their own bodies. So that was a very good term you used, spiritual confusion, and it's a tragic one in modern day society.
Yeah, indeed. We could also speak of a reductionism to sex and sexuality, to the mere biological dimension, forgetting not only the metaphysical value, but also on a mere basic level, I will say, the psychological dimension, which is still something which I mean, is not so metaphysical, but sometimes it's also forgotten. So this materialistic and mechanicistic idea that the sexual organs project are mechanically connected completely to a psychological dimension, to a spiritual dimension, is something which is a modern myth, we could say, because Evola tries to show that the question is more complicated, that there are different layers, and if we recall the traditional division of man on the three levels of body, anima, and spirit, which in Greek culture was described through the word soma, psyche, and nous, we can understand that the metaphysical archetypes of men and women should be understood on all these three different levels. And so the changing the body doesn't mean to change the soul. Sorry, I said anima, which is Italian, but I meant soul, which is not immediately related to change the spiritual dimension. So there is an interconnection of these levels, but not a mechanical causal relation. And in this way, also Evola also tries to avoid a too rigid dualistic dimension, because, as I've said, he's aware that the absolute woman and absolute man exist only on a spiritual, metaphysical level, but then on the level of the soul and on the body, he accepts that there are in nature and in history different levels through which an archetype manifests itself. But the point is that man should be aware of his mission, of his path, and try to pursue this path, and not to conceive sexuality just as an abstract possibility without meaning. The determination of our body is, from a traditional symbolical point of view, a sort of a sign which we receive from our soul, which is another sign received from the spirit. And in this way, Evola seems somehow open also to understand, to accept that there are men and women who have somehow also other tendency in themselves, but the horizon where they are constituted remain this one which is metaphysically founded.
Yeah. And would you agree with me if I say that Evola is building his theory about sex in such a way as he is building his theory of traditional and modern world? So as a distinction, there's a huge distinction between modernity and traditional world, because they are based on different principles, and spirituality is one of the most important. And he applies the same to metaphysics of sex, that the modern world erased all the spirituality from the sex and turned it into some kind of narcotic or some kind of quick pleasure.
Yeah, that's also completely a right interpretation of this book, I think. You have perfectly summarized the main point. I would just like maybe to add this information, which could be maybe useful for the viewer. Of course, it's not easy to speak about sex and love, because with this word we can define many different things, and they have been used and adopted in history to define many different phenomena. So Evola, in the introduction of the text, want to specify what does it mean when he speaks about sex, which is such an important word, which became part of the title, Metaphysics of Sex, in order not to be misunderstood. And he tried to refuse in his definition every dualistic conception. So for him, sex is, first of all, not only corporal and biological sex or sexuality, because as we were saying, it's also a spiritual phenomenon, but at the same time it's something which regards the concrete real sexual activity. So it's not only abstract, pure, platonic, so to say, love. And in this sense, it's useful the definition which Evola applied to the principle of metaphysics in his system, when he defines it as a kind of immanent transcendence, which is a transcendent principle which manifests himself in immanent world, so in history and nature. In the same way, the sex he discussed is not pure immanence, pure matter, nor neither pure spirituality and transcendence. Is a kind of spiritual principle incorporated in human activity, when this activity is realized for spiritual purposes and in a ritual and symbolic conditions. And so the most relevant pages of these books are precisely devoted to analyze how in different traditions and pre-modern societies this part of human life, sex and sexuality, was arranged and inserted in a sacred way of living. And so there are reflections about the sexual practices within, so to speak, institutional orthodox relation, so in family, in the relation recognized also from a social and political context, but also the completely esoteric practices where sex was used mainly as a sort of energetic dimension in order to achieve a specific state of awareness or spiritual states. So we could say that Evola had so to speak, an energetic idea of sex. So for him, sex is a sort of energy, a power, a cosmogonical and cosmological power, which is natural, but like every natural phenomenon, has also a symbolic meaning, and so a reference to metaphysics. And the point is that man needs to relate with this power according to a traditional knowledge and not being dominated by this force. So we need to use knowledge and will to govern this power and use for our spiritual benefit, and not be dominated and ruined by this energetical force, which of course is fascinating, attractive, and but can cause also several psychological and spiritual problems. and Evola is aware of that. And this is, I think, also a very actual topic in current society. So the negative side of a kind of sex liberated by morality, but also not lived through enough knowledge, enough awareness by people. This kind of approach to sexuality detains the risk to be no more actively engaging with this force, but the risk of being dominated and become object of this power.
Yeah. At the moment, we are witnessing a demographical catastrophe in the West, where the fertility rates are going down. So, in the political discourse, especially on the right side, they tend to see a relationship as a means to have children. It comes also from Catholicism, because Catholicism was very strongly emphasizing that marriage is a means to have children. And Evola is talking about this, let's call it biological view of a relationship between men and women at the beginning, but he's rejecting it, saying that there's much more to it. This transcendence, this metaphysics, this energy is a higher level than just only biology, yeah?
Yeah, that's another important topic in the book. I think that, of course, we need to distinguish the domains. So we don't know what Evola now will think about from a political level concerning the demographical crisis. And we could also make as hypothesis the idea that he also will be worried about it for political reason. But as you have introduced, dealing from a spiritual point of view with sex, he's very convinced that sex should not be reduced to a process in order to produce life. And in this sense, Evola thinks that different and opposite theories somehow converge paradoxically on this solution. So he criticized a lot the scientist, Darwinist theory at the beginning of the book, explaining that the reductionism of sexual activity to the preserve of the species is something which maybe works for describing animals, but not human attitude. And for example, he also reflects on the topic of pleasure within sexual activity, arguing that pleasure is not the aim, the final scope of sex, but is somehow a parallel phenomenon which accompanies this activity, which, however, in some cases, in some real concrete cases, doesn't produce just pleasure, but also, I mean, problems, sufferance, but is, however, desired because of this spiritual dimension. But at the same time, on this topic, he also criticized some religious position, such as the Catholic one, although he's a bit general on this topic, but the religious reductionism of sex to of the idea of just having children, making family, explicitly because, in his view, also the relation between sex and sons is something which is not deterministic and causal, although, of course, from a scientific point of view, it is, but in human comprehension of sex, there is always this energetic spiritual function which, according to Evola, prevails on the reasons of giving birth. And that's interesting because it's not probably the classic conservative position, so to speak, but represents an interesting reflection.
Yes, we went through the major topics of the book and the sense of the book itself, which is metaphysics that's ruling over pure biology when it comes to this subject. But there is one part of the book which could be very interesting also for the modern reader. I'm talking about sex in the realm of initiations and magic, when he talks about Kabbalah, tantric sexual practices, also this notion of magic and sex. Could you tell a little bit more about this part?
Yes. You mean the 6th chapter?
Yes, yes.
Yes. This chapter is, I will say, the most practical, so to speak, because whether in the previous ones, Evola dwells more into the theory of metaphysics of sex, so how sex is conceived from a traditional metaphysical perspective, which myth and religious narratives represent the sexual relationships, but also the archetypes of man and woman. So we have also this very interesting attempt to identify some archetypes of man and woman, and so on. In the 6th chapter, Evola tried to analyze some concrete practices which are conducted in occult, esoteric, and magic context in Western and Eastern world, where sex is precisely conceived as a rite, as a ritual practice. And here we can find some concrete hints towards some practices, which of course are not explained in details, but there are also some references through the quotation of sources and through some synthesis which Evola proposed. And as you have mentioned, we can find a comparative perspective. So there are several different traditions. I can mention briefly some of them. Mm-hmm. There is the topic of chastity in Christian tradition, especially, but not only. And this is another interesting element because if we have a rigorous religious esoteric approach to sex and we consider sex as energetic power, that doesn't mean automatically that we need to have a lot of sexual activity, but that we need to practice it. So here Evola explains that there are some ascetic paths where the refusal of sex, in this sense chastity, is useful in order to sublimate the sexual power through to direct him to the sky, to God. While in other practices, sex is concretely practiced. For example, in yoga, in Tantra yoga, a religious tradition on which Evola also has written the beautiful book, The Yoga of Power. Mm-hmm. Evola studied a lot this tradition. And there is also a interesting chapter where the tantric sexual practices are compared with the Chinese Taoist practices, which in Evola interpretation are showed as very similar. in both these traditions, the main idea is that in the sexual practices, the polarity of men and women are connected on a spiritual level, and the level of enlightenment can be reached when men, according to some specific practices, which are quite technical, is able not to conclude in a biological way the sexual act, instead to convert the sexual energy, which is concretely present in this tradition in the semen, through a practice which is called semen retention, and which, especially in the subtle physiology of Tantra Yoga, should be directed from the sexual organ to the mind, through the chakras. And this is the path to the enlightenment and to the liberation. So, as you can understand, a very specific kind of sexuality which should not be confused with the daily normal common practice. Then there are many other references, for example, to Jewish Kabbalah, to Eleusinian mysteries. And these traditions, Evola tries to go deep, but we have really few sources, especially the Eleusinian mysteries are very old. It's a very ancient traditions of the ancient Greek. But still there are some textual sources and some esoteric traditions which testify some practices of this kind. And then in the last chapters, also some currents of the so-called occult revival of modernity are analyzed. So there is a chapter devoted to the Miriam, which was a esoteric current founded by the Italian Kremmerz. Kremmerz is Giuliano Kremmerz is the pseudonymous for Ciro Formisano, an esotericist and hermetist, who spoke about sexual practices in his magic perspective. And Evola knew quite well also this esoteric current, also because there were some practitioners of Kremmer's thought also in the group of Ur. Okay. So it was a current which Evola discovered since the 20s of the last century. And then there are some reflections on the already mentioned Maria de Nagloska, and on the occult perspective of Aleister Crowley, probably the most famous magician of the last century.
Yeah.
And on both these characters, Evola has a complex attitude, I will say, in the way he recognized that their position are not completely traditional, and there are some mistakes in their comprehension of the role of sex, but at the same time they recognize them a spiritual value and the capacity to preserve through mysterious ways, also in their thought, some ancient truth. And the last section takes especially in consideration the book Magia Sexualis by Pascal Beverly Randolph, who is an esotericist and a magician, who in this book proposed practical consideration about it. And also on this book, Evola expresses interpretation, underlining the useful and the useful aspects, but also the mistakes in it. So to conclude, in this chapter we can find this attempt to analyze from a more practical and ritual point of view the theory surrounding the Wool book, where the metaphysics of sex is so understood on a double level, we could say. First of all, as in the traditional and philosophical sense of metaphysics, so an interpretation, a philosophical interpretation of the fundamental and absolute principle of sexuality, but then also in a more concrete and empirical sense, metaphysical as a dimension which involves the physical world, but also something invisible which stands behind this world, and which can be grasped in the concrete sexual life.
This part is so interesting. Of course, Evola before that talks about sex in different other historical traditions. In the Middle Ages, he's writing about the chivalrous love of the Middle Ages, the concept of sex and love in Christianity. But this part is so interesting because at the beginning of the 20th century, the occult, the Far East, Tantra, Kabbalah, all of these things were so popular, where people were looking for some kind of new spirituality, yes? And now I have an impression in the modern world, we don't have even that, because now most of the societies are interested in McDonald's and Netflix, and they are not even looking for some kind of sources of spirituality in other traditions. Don't you agree?
Yeah, that's interesting and somehow paradoxical, because our globalized world, with all its problems and negative issues, but theoretically could at least give us the chance to easily have contacts with other cultures and other sources. In this sense, Evola's warnings respect the risk of the so-called New Age culture and subculture is, of course, extremely interesting and valid from a theoretical point of view, but maybe, as you were arguing, no more so actual, because these currents are not so popular now. But it's also true, there are several studies that show that this kind of attempt to find the sacred and the spiritual in non-spiritual phenomena is, however, present also in some postmodern phenomena and processes. And so in this sense, Evola's insight and Evola's warning is still relevant. For example, to give a concrete example, all the culture of ecology has not only scientific and political sources, but as many studies have shown, also some symbolic references to a sort of feminine cult of the planet, this idea of the earth as Gaia or Gaia, the mother of the world, the association between the nature and the value, this naturalistic ideal where everything is natural means that he's good also from a moral point of view, and that resembles a little bit the myth of the Golden Age. All this kind of ecological attitude has somehow a sort of spiritualistic point of view, which is, of course, far away from a traditional perspective. But this is just one example, because there are several postmodern phenomena, also, for example, related to the world of technoscience, which seem to have also a sort of spiritual message inside. But these messages are often not really able to give real spiritual relief to man. And in this sense, Evola's approach is still actual and valid, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I think that the main notion is that the modern world is bringing everything to a lower degree. René Guénon was writing that about psychoanalysis, that as in the domain of politics, democracy is bringing everything to the lower level where the masses becomes the rulers. So psychoanalysis in the domain of man is bringing everything to the lowest level of unconscious and instincts. And I think that's the sense of what Evola is talking about, that the modern world is doing the same thing with sex. It's getting rid, it's erasing the spiritual, religious level of sex. And although Evola doesn't like the word religious, I've noticed that a lot of times that he's not using that. He prefers to use the word spiritual, yeah? But nevertheless, the sense is that modern world is erasing the spiritual level from this domain of sex.
I think this depends also from the comparative approach, at least in this book, where he tries to take in consideration so many different traditions, and some of them are properly religious in the sense of traditional religions, but some of them, as we have seen, should be better defined as esoteric or occult. So maybe the text goes beyond religions, but involves a lot the religious traditions. And what is interesting is that although we know that Evola was not Christian Catholic, and in some phases of his production, he also produced significant polemics against this tradition. In this text, the criticism is mainly devoted to the risk of sclerotization related to radical ascetism against sex proposed to the entire population, which seems something too abstract and too strong for an entire population. But there is, at the same time, there are many considerations which show respect and interest from Evola, also regarding some Christian ways of interpreting sexuality, especially in some esoteric currents, because he speaks of the way, especially Middle Age, the woman was elected as a sort of ideal by men, by especially in the context of the aristocracy, and in the by knights, and but also the religious symbolism in Christian alchemy, and in some literary and theological productions, such as the Divina Commedia by Dante, which is several times quoted as a fascinating and rich example of how to connect the love ideal with a theological path. And this again is because Evola is not proposing to have sex or not to have sex, but to understand the specific phenomenology of this cosmic power, and to understand that there are different spiritual ways of living this dimension, and also the ways of renounced ascetism can be, of course, a very rich way from a spiritual point of view, but probably is not for everyone. It's a specific way for specific men in specific times.
Yes, and Luca, to give a conclusion, you recorded few videos about this specific book of Evola, so I assume that you are a fan of this book and it's important for you. How would you encourage modern reader to read it? Why it's important for you?
Thank you for the question. I find this book extremely fascinating, and I suggest to read it together with maybe a more famous book by Evola, which is Ride the Tiger, Cavalcare la Tigre, which was not by chance published only 3 years after Metaphysics of Sex in 1961, because both books belong, in my opinion, to a common approach. We are after the Second World War, and Evola is trying to propose individual approaches for men who want to survive in the ruins, and not only survive, but also to active engage with the real concrete world where we are doomed to live, in order to grasp the best that we can. And Gianfranco De Turris, in the Italian introduction to this book, speaks about this approach as a sort of existential strategy. Evola is giving an existential strategy in order to face our age. And the richness of examples and of different paths proposed by Evola, I think, can encounter the favor of different readers who somehow, through their different backgrounds, experience, and spiritual attitude, can always find, I think, something positive from reading this book. Today, I think we have already introduced this topic. We witness a sclerotization of the dualist perspective on sex, which was already denounced by Evola. In one direction, we see processes of corruption, degeneration in materialist sense, but at the same time, conversely, cancel culture, politically correct, propose a sort of neo-Puritanist model, which is completely distant from European tradition, also from traditional Catholicism. And Evola's text opened as an important reflection, in my opinion, on how to sacralize a part of human experience which can't be hidden or removed, and instead requires a metaphysical framework if we don't want to live and experiment this part of life, so to speak, by chance. But instead, if we want to have knowledge on that and be aware of which kind of dynamics are part of this sector of life experience, which is somehow part of our life.
So I think it's the best conclusion you could have give. So thank you very much for it. So we urge anyone to read this book and to go in more deeper into whole bibliography of Julius Evola. and I think he is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. And together we are on a quest to make him more and more popular and influential in the Western world, because he is one of the keys for the survival of our world, which is in very, very bad shape at the moment. So, Luca, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you again for the invitation, for the conversation, and the opportunity to speak also to an international public to these very interesting and relevant topics.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope we will talk again. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.